For joining us this afternoon. Grace, such a pleasure to have you here and speak with us.
Thank you.
Before we begin, a few biographical brushstrokes, ever so broad, but it's our sincere pleasure to have Grace join us today. We started speaking and working with her about a year ago and have recently put together a show of her night blooms. You will see these works on paper in rotation as we go along, and then these will be followed by some paintings, and we will address all of these works. Grace was born in 1956 in Rockville Center, New York, and studied at Skidmore College before receiving her MFA at Columbia University in 1986. She has recently presented her work at the Hyde Collection in Glens Falls and the Center for Maine Contemporary Art in Rockland, Maine, among others. And upcoming installations include projects at the Heckscher Museum and EFA projects in New York. Her works can be found in the public collections of the Tang Teaching Museum, the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C., and the University of New England in Portland, Maine, among many others. And for a full biography, please visit our website or Grace's website. Grace is based in Maine and has been based there for decades. So it's wonderful to be able to talk today via Zoom. And let's dive right in. Let's begin with your vocabulary, the geometric abstraction, the reference points. When did you start developing it, and what are your influences? Hold on one second, Grace. I would like to remind everyone to please mute themselves.
Somebody's not muted.
Someone is not muted. Okay, now I think you can go ahead. Now it's muted.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, thank you. Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Amanda. And thanks to the Jason McCoy Gallery for giving me this opportunity to have a conversation with you today about my work. I started using a geometric vocabulary about 25 years ago now. And previous to that, I was using both botanical images and also geometric images. And I was juxtaposing them, and I was thinking about ideas of duality. And then at one point, I just was in my studio drawing, and I overlapped two circles, two stencils of circles, and this shape came, and it's called the Vesica Pisces. It's created by overlapping two circles. And on the left of your screen right now, if you see that shape, that's the shape of a leaf or an almond or an eye. That is the Vesica Pisces shape. And I was so drawn to it immediately. And I think it's because it is a geometric shape, but it has organic qualities. And I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know it had a name, but I began doing research about it. You know, this is about 25 years ago. And that's when I started to not use botanical images anymore and focus totally on geometric images and doing a lot of research on geometric shapes.
Grace, how did this research, what did that look like? Did you go into literary references or visual references? Where did you start? So I found the shape and then you begin. Where did you begin?
It's a good question. I started, I was always interested in symbols and archetypes, and I already had several books that that discussed symbols and talked about their meanings in cultures across all around the world and also across time. And, you know, most of the symbols had similar meanings across time and across cultures. And I was really fascinated by that. And I started to think about how similar that was to archetypal images that also function across time and culture. And then I discovered sacred geometry, and I started reading and studying actually sacred geometry, and that also informed my interest.
But this interest was primarily visual, or did it matter to you what the different shapes mean or how they were interpreted or what they symbolize in different cultures? Was the content important?
Yes, the content was definitely important to me. And, you know, it was actually surprising to me that I was really attracted to the geometric shapes, because I think I always had this idea that geometry was dry, you know, that it was boring, that it was masculine even. And then when I started doing the research, it really opened up to me.
But of course, geometry has that implication of perfection, the perfect lines that intersect. And yet, of course, you work by hand, and especially in these watercolors, you can, when you see the works in person, see these little quote unquote imperfections, which are so
Right.
beautiful and make the work breathe. And that, of course, is a very important part of your work, that you can see that they're made by hand. You don't
Yes.
use tools
Yes.
that make it too industrial.
Right, exactly. And I think that's probably what I did not like about some geometric abstraction work that I was familiar with, that it was taped and it was very opaque. So it was hard edged. And I was not interested in that. What I am interested in is transparency and optical qualities and the kind of what, as you mentioned, when you see mistakes or when you see where maybe some of the paint is heavier in places than in other places, in this particular piece, it makes it breathe. I think that's a really good way of describing it. And it also suggests, you know, a collective humanity. And I think that an example of that might be, for example, Navajo weaving. That's the example I'm thinking of. And weaving in general, where you have a lot of the same marks over and over, repeated, they're on a grid, but yet there's always mistakes and there's always small things that give life to that grid.
And that's kind of where we find the artist too, the little imperfections that come through. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you choose in this series a medium like watercolor, which is very, on one hand, very unforgiving and very hard to control. So it's almost you're setting yourself up with an extra challenge.
Yeah, I use the watercolor a little bit differently, I think, than, for example, a landscape watercolorist. I do use stencils to make these forms. At one point, I made all my own stencils, and now I have them cut so that they're really, really crisp. And
what material do you use for that?
Excuse me?
What material do you use for the stencils?
Oh, I have them cut by a mat maker. So it's like a thick mat board. Mm-hmm. And so I think you think about stencils sometimes, a plastic stencil. If I tried to use that, the pigment would go underneath the stencil. Using the mat board, since it's porous, it can sometimes suck up a little bit of the paint around the edge, and that way I don't get a bleed underneath the stencil.
How pre-planned are the compositions? Do you decide on the shapes you want to use, or do you already know the entire composition beforehand? How much improvisation happens by the time you start?
Mm-hmm. Well, for example, in this series, you know, the circle is on every single sheet of paper. So I might make 8 or 10 drawings with just the transparent sphere and put them in a grid up on my studio wall, and then decide, you know, I'm going to put a square in the center of these two, or I'm going to overlay the Vesica Pisces in 4 of them. And so they build up like that as a series. And they talk to each other, and I might find a solution in one drawing that I might bring to another one. And so it's really a generative process that way.
Mm-hmm. I like the wording used, talk to each other, but they also build on each other in that sense. One can spring from the other.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
And you often work in series. That is maybe something we talk about. When did that begin? That you started to work in series or think in series in terms of materials, formats?
Yeah, it first came to my attention in graduate school that the idea of working in a series could help you focus, decide what to leave out and what to concentrate on. But I wasn't that good at it at that point. But I'd say in the last 15 years or more, I've really been working in series exclusively. The series on black paper that I completed right before I began the Night Bloom series has 110 drawings in it. And so I worked on that series for many years. And one thing I like about the series, like a large series like that, is when you lay it out or when you're looking at the images, online, you can actually see your thinking. I can see how, I thought about this shape, and then I added this, and then I focused on that for a while. Then something came in, and then I circled back, and then you can see it. And so it's really like a journal of your thinking over time.
And by the end of a series, do you feel that your exploration has been resolved, or do you imagine coming back to it at a certain point? How finite is it?
I think with the series of 105 drawings that I recently completed, it went over several years, and I would stop for a couple of months and then I would pick it back up. But that's a very long series, and I have other series that I've done that are 10, 12, 20, and they're complete at where, right where they are. But at this point, I do see myself, going back and revisiting things. I think that might be partially my age, but I'm still responding, and these images are still resonant for me. And my idea now is just to make them have more and more clarity. And if that's using formal ways, color, materials, that's really where I'm digging in.
What does that clarity mean for you? Is it the relationship between the different components to each other? Because I think for most of us looking at your work, it seems, that these compositions are very clear. They are very specific. So it seems that you're, by mentioning that, are looking even deeper or searching for something else beyond.
The clarity,
is it a clarity of thought, or is it the clarity of a specific iconic shape that you try to draw out?
I think that when I say clarity, what I'm really thinking about is that the image has resonance for me. I'm thinking back to when Kandinsky said something about a painting or an image is complete when it has kind of a sound to it, where it's not something that's easy to describe. But I think that's why I work in series, because I'm trying to find the best way for that image to be.
Do you ever dismiss images? I mean,
yes.
Works at the end of the day that you just discard because they're not working for you?
Yes. In fact, I was going to say that the Night Bloom series began about a year ago when I was looking at a drawing of a compass from the 16th century, and a French cartographer named, I think, Orion Fine. I'm not quite sure on the name, but and I loved the drawing, and I love the idea of a compass because I've been always very interested in directions, north, south, east, west, and I started making drawings from the image, watercolors, and I worked on a lot of them. And I think I made 25 that I threw out. Well, actually, I didn't throw them out. I have them all folded up and, in a flat file, but they're not anything that I'm interested in showing anyone. And I was really fighting with it, really struggling with it. And so these are really the pieces that came out of this interest in the compass drawing. And so this star shape that you see here, is directly from the compass drawing.
Beautiful. Let's talk about the choice of paper, which is not a true black. It's more like a very dark gray. It has a matte quality to it. It's a little hard to show on the screen here, but how did you decide on a dark background?
I've been using the black paper. This is Somerset paper, printmaking paper. And I've been using it for probably almost 15 years now. And, I hadn't really thought about using dark paper, but I have recorded dreams for about 40 years. And so I love the idea of images that come to you at night. I'm interested in the collective unconscious and Carl Jung's ideas, and I also love the night sky. Ooh, I'm getting an echo. Are you?
I'm hearing you. I'm hearing you.
Okay, I'll just ignore the echo. And then I think that I remember really loving Lee Bonteque's drawings with colored pastel on black paper. They're so beautiful. And I liked Rudolf Steiner's blackboard drawings, which I got a chance to see in person at the Venice Biennale in 2013. And I just love the way the watercolor looks on the black paper. And I've been working on it for a long time now. And I've also worked on very, very large sheets of black paper that I bought in a roll. Right. So on the right here is a drawing that I did during the pandemic called Lattice Night. And so I have this huge roll of paper, and that's about 80 by 50, that drawing.
And what is that shape based on that we're seeing?
That's actually based on a dream that I had right before the pandemic of a ladder of cubes. And so I've been working with the cube, and I thought about maybe making a sculpture of it. But instead, I decided to make this drawing. I made several paintings also. And the idea of the ladder and going from one place to another, I began to think about it in relation to the pandemic and how we needed to transcend the place that we were at in so many ways. And the ladder is an ancient symbol from going from one place to another, hopefully in the right direction up.
It's interesting that you mentioned that you contemplated sculpture, because one of my questions that I had for you today was if you ever thought about working in a different medium, opening up your vocabulary to either installation or sculpture, because it seems to lend itself to kind of an immersive environment or a spatial experience.
Yeah, I've been thinking about sculpture a lot over the years, and I actually have a list of images that I would like to make. I haven't up to this point. I thought about making this particular lattice image out of wire with amber colored glass beads over the wire. And so you'd have these spheres or these cubes, and they could be, they go from floor to ceiling, and they could cover a whole wall, or they could cross a space. So I still have that in my mind. And in terms of installation, I'm always thinking about how I can show my work together, the paintings, the drawings, even a grid of drawings like this. I would love to show a huge grid of drawings on black paper together. And I do love the idea of the drawings and the paintings being together and being connected, because the images are the same, but they're so different in the paintings than they are in the drawings.
And they're fairly large. So if you stand in front of them, even the smaller works here on the left side, they kind of frame the whole torso of the viewer. So you're really diving into the composition. And of course, our project together was digital due to the pandemic, but even so here in the studio, you show everything unframed. Is that how you ideally show your work without any kind of bordering around it?
I show the black paper, the works on black paper framed. I think if I was going to do a really large grid, they would be unframed. I love being close to the paper so that you can see the paper. To me, that's so important. But then there's the issue of protecting the drawings. I think the drawing on the right, the lattice drawing, I also have one on light blue paper, which is day. So it's lattice night and day. Those would never be framed. They're so big. So, so both, either.
Amanda, it would be lovely to dive into the paintings too, if we could get some images. And Grace, to talk a little bit about the difference between the works on paper and the paintings, because the works on paper are not preparatory studies, of course. So they, they're kind of members of the same family, but they don't necessarily necessitate each other. I see them kind of as separate entities. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how you see them in relation to each other, and what you get out of painting that you don't get out of the works on paper.
Well, the first thing is color. So the work on the black paper is in some ways preparatory for the paintings, because I explore the images that I'm going to use in the paintings. But I have the paintings and drawings going on at the same time, so I go back and forth. So it's not as if I stop with the drawings and then begin the paintings. It is a back and forth kind of conversation between the paintings and the drawings. I love color so much, but I feel like when I'm working on the drawings, I can focus on the image. I can focus on the shape. And sometimes it's a little hard to break off from the black drawings to color, but it works. And once I'm using color, it's so wonderful to have the image that I want to make and then just focus on the color. The grounds of these paintings are made with oil and wax. I've been using wax as a medium instead of turpentine for quite a few years now. And I brush the ground on, for hours to get this gradation that you see here. And then I have it completely dry before I put the blue circle. And then again, completely dry before the green square goes on. So I work from back to the front, and I don't work wet on wet at all. So everything has to have drying time in between them. So the paintings take a lot longer than the work on paper. And that's another reason why the work on paper is so great, because I can make so many of them so quickly, because there's really very little drying time in the drawings.
And of course, a big difference between these paintings here and what we saw before, the night blooms, is the format, the square format. And maybe talk a little bit about your interest in Joseph Albers, because of course the square and then the square and the square and the color theory are reference points that are evident to everyone who looks at these works. But maybe from a personal point of view, you can talk a little bit about what your thought was behind that.
Yeah, so the circle and the square, obviously they're geometric images that everyone is very, very familiar with. I have been very interested in recent years in the way the circle and the square, the places that they pop up. For example, I've been studying Tibetan mandalas, and you've got squares within circles within squares. But then you can go back to the 16th century drawing of a tempietto, a church. And that is also a square within a circle, or a circle within a square. And so these very basic images are just visible throughout history in a lot of places that are sacred, the sacred space of the tempietto, or the meditative sacred space of a Tibetan mandala. And so I was just interested in using those square and the circle in a very minimal kind of way. The square was a big change for me because I have been using golden ratio to decide on the size of my canvases for many years. But at some point, a couple of years ago, I started thinking, well, why am I putting these central iconic images in a rectangle? Why don't I just put them in a square? Why fight that kind of composition anymore? So yeah, so these are the first square paintings I've done in quite a long time. Although I did use the square about 20 years ago, but this is the first time in a long time.
And these works have all this beautiful detail that's hard to see from afar as we're watching them. But maybe for everyone to see the beading on the lower right of the blue circle, there's color variations, kind of subtleties that you weave into the composition that, of course, would be much more apparent if you were to stand right in front of it in a gallery. But please talk a little bit about these details that you kind of weave into these compositions. It brings back what you were talking about earlier, these Navajo tapestries, for example, where there's these little, almost little secrets or stumbling blocks that are put in to draw the attention.
Yeah, they really just come. I don't put them in they come as a part of the process. So I don't decide to put in a few red. I'm just thinking to myself, would red look good? You know, would blue? And I'll just try it. And I'll try it at a few places. I'll probably decide, no, I want to go back to the two colors that I had already decided on, but I'll just leave them there. And I think they do give a little bit more life and movement and visual interest. And so they're just part of the painting, but I want them to be part of the painting as the painting is made, not something that I decide beforehand or afterwards.
Is there an ideal context for your work? Do you have a particular environment in mind where the works could be seen?
Well, I always love the work to be seen in natural light. I try to make the work in natural light as much as I can. And I love the way natural light looks on paintings. I would be very interested in showing them in a sacred space. If you know, that kind of opportunity would arise, that I would love that. Otherwise, I do really like clean, minimal kind of space because, and I also like a bench in front of my paintings where people can sit in front of them for an extended period of time, because I really think of my work as slow art. You know, it takes a long time. You need to be with it for a while before you begin to appreciate the optical qualities and the kind of pulsing that can arise from color. Can we show the three paintings together, and I can talk a little bit about the Albers. Thank you, Amanda. These paintings go together. I would love them to remain together forever. They're called Emanation, and it's dusk, night, and dawn. And I use the idea of relational color in my paintings. In fact, I rarely mix color. And in these three paintings, the ground colors are different, and the color blue for the circles are exactly the same, and the green square color is exactly the same. And so when you see the paintings together like this, you can see how the ground colors change the way you perceive the blue and the green. And that's you know, one of the ideas that Joseph Albers' color theory covers. And I'm endlessly fascinated by how color can change on a shifting ground. I studied with someone at college as an undergraduate who was a student of Albers. And so I took color theory with her. So it's been an idea that I've had, you know, in the back of my mind for a long time.
Grace, I want to weave in a question from the chat, which is about going back and forth between drawing and painting, because you were talking about the drawing process and, you know, how you can go back and forth. How do you hold on to the image of the work. So how do you hold on to the image in the painting if you have to kind of let it go and you focus on something else and you come back to it quite a bit later? How does it stay present for you?
Well, I think they're definitely related. And as I said earlier, my work is generative. And so the images are unfolding from each other. And so I don't think I ever really let go of it. I have most of the paintings, they're all out together. So if I'm not working on it, it doesn't mean I'm not looking at it. It doesn't mean I'm not thinking about it. It just means it's probably in a drying period, which can sometimes be a week. It couldn't even be longer with the very transparent pigments that I'm using right now. It can be 2 weeks. But I don't let go of it. I'm always thinking about it. And I think if that's what the question is, really more about thinking, or if it's more about materials, because my work has to dry so thoroughly before I put a second layer. It's just the way that process works. Yeah, so different from working wet on wet.
At this point, I'd like to encourage anyone who has a question to give us a sign or type it into the chat. One general question I have for you, Grace, is do you think art is a language?
Definitely. I always think of my paintings as a visual language, and I think of geometry as a vocabulary.
Do you see it as a means to communicate with the viewer directly? Do you think of the audience when you work? That's
a good question. At different points, I think of the audience. Not at the beginning when I'm, working with a new image or a new idea. But for example, with these 3 paintings on the left, which are from the Continuum series, one way I always keep the audience in mind, the viewer in mind, is that I want those paintings to work really, really well from a distance. I want them to be pulsing optically, and I want the color to be, really, really clear. But when you walk up, you also, if your eyes are 2 inches away from the painting, it'll also be really interesting, and it will also be beautiful. So that's something that I really, really keep in mind for the viewer throughout my whole process, that the paintings work from a distance, and that they also work really well close up. And this is the perfect installation shot to have up while you're saying this. Yeah. It's wonderful to see this installation from afar, and you just want to right now walk up and see them and see all this detail. You want to see, a detail. And so, each of these paintings on the left here in this series, each of them took about between 3 and 4 months to make. And so when I was talking about the Navajo weavings earlier, these paintings really relate to those images. And this series, which is called the Continuum series, there's probably about 30 paintings in it. They're not all this big. Some are, actually there is one that's even larger, but it's an idea that I worked with for a long time. The show is called Temporality. And so there were 2 ideas here where temporality, time, that the work took me a long time. And that I think when you see these in person, you can feel that sense of time that went into it. But also I think that, there's thousands and thousands of small beads in these paintings, or I call them beads. They're really dots of color. But the beads for me, or the dots of color, represent an actual bead, an actual prayer bead, or a bead from a rosary. And so when you're looking at these paintings in person, you can get that sense of what it might be like to hold a bead, then move to the next bead, then move to the next bead, and really be present in the time that you're doing that. And so I really wanted to be present when I was making these paintings, and it's the only way you can do it, because you have to stay on top of it or you lose your way.
Well, there's a meditative quality to making work, not just to kind of going through the final images. Is there an aspect of ritual in your
yes.
practice? Do you have certain things you do before you get started on working on something specific, or?
Well, when I'm preparing to work on a painting like that, on the large painting, that's a very specific kind of process. And I like quiet. I don't want any talk radio. I don't even want any music because it gets in the way of thinking, really, for me. I'm not a good multitasker. So I think I use, like, for a series like this, which is the hour series, I'll start by deciding on the canvas size and how many. These are 8 for 8 hours in a day. And I put the ground colors on all of these paintings before I started anything else, so that I had this kind of day to night, throughout morning, throughout the day to night, light to dark, basically. And then with the stencil, I put on the circular shapes that are in the center. So, this is a series that has to be together because there's a mathematical sequence happening throughout it. And to take one out breaks that sequence. So, this was a very specific series that I made for this space. And at the Tang Museum up at Skidmore College, where I graduated from. And on the left, there's, I don't know if you can see that Monier Farmanian, amazing Iranian artist who died a few years ago. That's a piece of hers on the left. I love her work.
It goes together so beautifully. A couple questions here in the chat. One, I'm going to read it just out. Would you please elaborate on the idea you described as collective humanity? I believe you were relating it to imperfection in your geometry, perhaps imperfection more generally.
Yes, because that's a good question, because I think at the beginning, Stephanie, you said something about geometry and perfection, and I'm kind of on that edge there. I love the idea of the clean lines and the transparency and the perfection. But yet, and this is a great example to look at these images here. Some of these images are from the Rubin Museum. There are a couple of shaker drawings, and they're all about, it's called the cosmology wall. So they're worlds that people create, usually related to ritual and religion. But the idea of a collective humanity that nothing is perfect, that brings us together, that we're all trying to strive to be better, strive for a better world.
And one different question, kind of looking at the different materials you use, from watercolor, drawing, oil, do the different materials change the way you conceptually approach your work?
Yes, I think so. I'm always trying to bring it all together, but I never really can, because the watercolor is so different from the oil. And maybe one of the basic reasons is because the oil is has such a Western tradition behind it. And the watercolor has more of an Eastern tradition. And so those two things, that's a big duality. And while I'm trying to bring it together, it's difficult. And I think I've gotten better at it, but that's definitely a struggle. That's definitely something that I'm working on.
And I think when we spoke in the past, you sometimes refer to your work as an attempt to bridge Eastern and Western thought and language. Yes, because obviously I'm a Western person,
And so I was trained, to focus on Western art. I found Eastern art really on my own, and I've educated myself, and I can bring it into it. But that's not who I am. So yeah, that's another edge that I've been on for a long time, and I like being there. But it's always something that I'm thinking about, and it's a great question.
And then a question asking if you can elaborate a little bit more about sound and the relationship to three-dimensional space and distance.
I think sound is really, for me, is really related to color and to these kind of iconic single images that I place in the center of the composition. They just somehow, when they're working, when they're right, they have a sound for me. As far as the sculpture goes, wow, I don't, that's in my future. I really, I'm not a sculptor, and I don't know what will happen as far as that goes.
Could you envision collaboration with a musician?
Yes, I actually think that collaboration would be the best thing, because that would get me going. I love my collaboration with the printmaker, Valpuri Remling, when I was out at Tamarind for a week a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. When you're working with someone who's an expert at a medium, and you're unfamiliar with it, but you have an image that you want to translate into that medium, it would be amazing to collaborate. Yeah.
Do you have an ideal project in mind? Maybe something that has been lingering in the back of your mind for some years, and you haven't been able to either see it through because of technical difficulties, or maybe you haven't found the right form for it?
Yeah,
ambition, perhaps?
I would think that even just looking at this drawing on the right, I could just imagine it as a sculpture, a three-dimensional beaded cubes hanging from a ceiling. I mean, I can picture it in my mind, and when I had the dream, it was a sculpture. And I have several very, very potent kind of dream images. Like for example, I'm really interested in the circle and the square and the triangle. And one dream that I had that I've written down and I would like to sculpt, well, it's actually carved, would be a circle, a square, and triangle carved right out of a wall. So there's two rooms, and there would be music inside the shapes, and the music would be flowing out of the circle, out of the square, out of the triangle. So I actually did write a proposal for an installation that had the cube of ladders, that had these shapes with the music flowing out of them. And, they're all things that technically I would love to collaborate, because I can't imagine figuring it all out myself.
Mm-hmm. And then one more question or favor to ask, please, to elaborate a little bit more on your research about the symbols that you're using across your work and the different cultural references.
Yeah, I have a stack of books, 5 or 6 books that are all like, they're really basically symbol dictionaries, where you can look up a symbol and you'll see, or you can look up a word, like for example, waves, or what would be something even better than that? Well, just like even a geometric shape, like triangle, and it'll list these books will list different cultures, how the shape was used. Sometimes there will be illustrations, or there will be photographs of artworks that have used that shape in that culture. And there's a lot of overlap in these dictionaries, but sometimes there's something very unique said And I actually check them and look at them all the time. I don't have my stack here, it's up in the studio. But if anyone was interested, I'd be happy to share the names and the authors of all those books. And, I could just be contacted via my website for that list.
And we're happy to forward that on too. That's a really nice offer. Maybe as a final question, because we're trying to keep these talks, informative, but also kind of short and sweet. But is there a shape, Grace, that is kind of has the most personal meaning for you? Is there one that is kind of the quintessential ingredient of your work, you would say? One that you've always been going back to?
I think there are a couple. I always go back to this abstracted geometric version of the moon, which I love, and then which on the left in the center, and then on the right, that Vesica Pisces shape. I think because it really began my search and my study of sacred geometry, and because it just seems to have so much resonance, I would have to say the Vesica Pisces.
Well, thank you, Grace. Thank you for all these wonderful answers and sharing the work with us to begin with. And I'm excited to see what's headed next.
Yeah.
Go into sculpture. You heard it here first.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I appreciate it. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you. And please, to everyone, if there's questions that you have and would like to ask privately, we're happy to forward them on to Grace or answer them ourselves if we can. But
okay. Thank you for everybody for attending.
Have a lovely afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.